Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. It's game 14, the last classical game of the World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren. The score is 6.5, 6.5, and the winner of this game is going to be the new world champion. In case it's going to be a draw, then we are heading to the tie breaks, which are going to be played tomorrow. But first, we have this game. Let's see what is going to happen. Ding Liren opens with 1d4, and after knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, we are in the Nimzo Indian, which was featured in game 8 of this match. Ding goes for the move e3, and after castling kingside, well, we have this Rubinstein variation, and it can lead to really exciting type of play. And in game 8, Ding played here the move a3, but obviously Team Nepo had prepared an improvement there, which was really needed because after a3, bishop takes, b takes, pawn to d6, knight e2, c5, knight g3, knight c6, just a small wrap-up of what happened in that game. There followed this amazing move rook a2, and white got fantastic attacking chances in that game. But for this occasion, Ding goes back to the move bishop d2, which is also quite an interesting line, which has gained in popularity over the last few years. With this move, white avoids the doubling of pawns and is always able to recapture with the bishop on c3. Black goes for d5, and only now Ding plays the move a3. So that in case of bishop takes c3, white is going to recapture with the bishop. Everything is looking fine, but the principled continuation is bishop to e7. And keeping the pieces on the board. And well, here white goes knight f3. This was all seen in an earlier game played last year by Ding against Pragnananda in the Chessable Masters tournament. In that game, Prag played here the move b6, very interesting idea, so that the bishop can either be developed to b6, to b7 or a6. But Nepo comes well prepared, plays the move c5, principled reaction, trying to equalize the game in a comfortable manner by trying to trade off all these pawns in the center. And that's going to happen. White captured on c5, and now bishop takes c5. And here, interesting moment. There's a choice for white. He can take on d5 with the pawn, after which probably black is recommended to take with the e-pawn, accepting the isolated pawn. But it's not really a weakness, because black can potentially become very active with ideas like knight c6, bishop g4, and at the right moment even a move d4 could be considered. Black is absolutely fine here. So for that reason, Ding decides to maintain the tension, at least for the moment. Goes for the move queen c2. Very interesting idea, so that the queen is looking indirectly at the bishop on c5. But there are also other ideas, which will become clear very soon. Nepo goes for d takes c4, which is interesting. There was one other Grandmaster game, Donchenko against Wojtaszek, in which the move knight c6 was played. But then white can put a little bit of pressure along the d file by playing rook d1. So that's one of the other ideas of placing the queen on c2 first. But as I said, Nepo very well prepared. Seemed as if he was still in book after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and now knight bd7. Excellent move. The knight is doing well here, and basically black's main plan is to get the bishop out via b6 to b7. And if you look at this position, if you give this position to any player basically in the world, I think most people, they would just castle here, no doubt about it. It's a very solid move, and after something like b6, bishop b7, well, it's a symmetrical position. It could potentially be a very boring, solid draw. But instead, Ding has something different in mind. He goes for the move rook d1. So he consciously postpones the decision to castle kingside. And now Nepo played very fast the move bishop e7, but I think there was absolutely no reason to go for that move. Why not just play b6? I think that's the ideal move. So that after something like knight e4, which is white's main idea, trying to get his bishop and bring its own bishop to c3. So now after knight takes e4, queen takes e4, this rook is in trouble. And if you would go rook b8, there is bishop c3, and there are a lot of threats along the d-file, beautiful bishops, and potential threats against the black king. So white would be much better in that case. But there's no need to panic here for black. Just play bishop b7 instead, so that after knight takes c5, knight takes c5, you're surrendering the bishop here. But after, let's say, bishop c3, queen e7, black is very solid, ready to place pieces on the d-file, put a bishop on e4, or even a knight on e4. Black is active enough to compensate the bishop pair. But bishop e7 played, and now Ding could have gone for a reasonable move like e4, so that the bishop can be released very soon. And most importantly, e5 would be a serious move to consider. But instead, he decided to go for knight g5. What is he planning to do? Is he planning to go back to e4, initiate the exchange of knights? Well, black played h6, offering white a choice what to do with a knight. But Ding is not interested in playing it in a solid way. Look what he did now. He played his move h4. Fantastic idea. And here we see why he decided to not to castle yet. He needed this rook on the h-file to get his attacking move in. Because hg5 attacks the knight. And if the knight moves, it's going to be checkmate on h7. So the knight cannot be taken. But also a developing move like b6 would be a serious mistake, as it does run into the move knight c to e4, intending to get rid of the main defender of the h7 square. And if you would take, I'm going to recapture with the queen with a double attack on the rook, as well as the h7 square is a mating threat. So things are potentially very dangerous, but Nepo understood very well white's intentions, and rather than making a decision yet what to do with a knight, he played here the move queen c7, attacking the bishop on c4, key move. And white has a lot of ways of playing here. He could drop back basically to any square with a bishop. But once again, if something like knight e4 is going to be played, black is going to take. And if you renew the mating threat with the queen, there is knight f6 attacking the queen, covering the square. Black is in good shape once he is able to get out its light squared bishop and connect its rooks. So a lot of possibilities. Also knight b5. Attacking the queen is a serious option, but queen c6 would be the main response, attacking the pawn on g2. And if white is going to do something about it, let's say play f3, still black is not going to take the knight on g5, but instead there is knight e5, putting pressure on the bishop, and well, the attack is over. Black is in great shape, as he's going to force the exchange of pieces. And at the end of the line, once queens are getting swapped, the knight on g5 is still hanging. So Ding decided to go back to e2. Understandable move. Still, black is not going to take the knight. And Nepo decided to play here rook d8. Should be said, though, that b6, once again, was a very tempting move. And it remains a mystery to me why he didn't play this move. Because after all, you would like to develop your bishop. If you can put it on b7, black has an excellent position, because the knight itself, it's not doing that much. So b6 was still interesting move. Probably he didn't like bishop f3, but then at least bishop b7 is there. But if Nepo would have been in great shape, maybe he would have spotted also this move, bishop a6. Incredible resource, with the idea that after bishop takes a8, you don't take back, you go for the move knight c5, intending to jump in with the knight to d3, with huge threats, as the king will have to move into the diagonal of the bishop. There are a lot of threats favoring black. But anyway, this didn't happen. Rook d8 on the board, so that very soon the knight can come to f8, guard the h7 square. White realized that there's not much to do here. Play the move rook c1 to protect the queen. And if now a move like b6, there is knight d5. Excellent shot. If you do take the knight, it's queen h7 with checkmate to come. So the idea is to deflect the knight. Of course, you're threatening the queen as well. If queen takes c2, there's knight takes e7, king f8, rook takes c2, king takes e7, and something like knight f3. White has the bishop pair with ideas to go bishop b4 next. White is a bit better, for sure. But Nepo played here the move knight f8, with the point that knight d5 no longer works because of knight takes d5, and the knight covers the mating square. After queen takes, knight takes, rook takes, material's even, but not for long, because black has the intermediate move, bishop d6, attacking the rook. If the rook moves, the knight on g5 is still hanging. So knight ge4 was played, offering the exchange of pieces. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, maybe queen takes e4 was also interesting, but Ding decided differently, recaptured with the knight. And now queens come off the board, but it looks as if only black can be better here. There are absolutely no problems for black any longer. The attack has fanned off, but probably it's still pretty balanced. But here, look what Ding played now. He wanted to force the issue here with the move bishop b4, which is a very radical decision. And frankly, I don't like it too much, because these double pawns, they can only become vulnerable in the long run. Bishop c6, questioning the knight. And still, white could have gone bishop f3, trying to hold the position together. His position is a bit worse. But instead, Ding played very aggressively with knight c5, even in the queenless middle game. Bishop takes g2, rook g1. So if the bishop moves, well, you got to think about a pawn on b7. Black played bishop d5, maybe bishop b6. Bishop c6 would have been also interesting, provoking the move b5 and only then come back to d5 with the bishop, with the point that after e4, the principal move, the bishop is almost trapped, but you have the counter move b6. Excellent idea. So that now after e takes d5, b takes c5, there's not a pawn on b4. Otherwise there could have followed b takes c5 and white would have a passed pawn. Looks as if black is in good shape here. After rook takes c5, rook takes d5, rook takes, e takes. Well, this double pawn, it's a little bit annoying, but still black also has an extra pawn on d5, 3 versus 2 on the queen side. Only black is playing for a win here. But Nepo played bishop d5, e4, and now bishop c6. Allowing the move b5, attacking the bishop. So the bishop had to go back to e8, and white regains the pawn. Knight takes b7. But okay, structurally speaking, white has a lot of weak pawns. Look at the pawn on b5, pawn on e4, pawn on h4. It's not clear at all. Rook d4, threatening to take the pawn. And in case of something like f3, the idea is to go rook b8, attacking the knight. If the knight goes away, we can take on b5, and black is a very healthy pawn up. Instead, rook c4 played, offering the exchange of rooks. But if that happens, and you go rook b8, there is a knight d6 still. So instead, black decides to keep the rooks on the board so that the knight cannot come to d6. Knight is under threat. And here, curious moment, absolutely, because Ding touched his knight, placed it on c5, but then decided to put it back on b7. He was in shock. Apparently something went through his mind, realizing that maybe knight c5 is not the best move. But just after a couple of minutes, he played the move anyway. But you can feel the nerves are playing a huge role at this point. He is under pressure. Black is in the driver's seat now. And pins the knight. Rook c7. Rook c3. Rook a c8. And here Ding went for the move b4. Very understandable move, trying to support the knight on c5, but probably better would have been knight b7. This is a very interesting idea. The knight cannot be taken as the rook will be taken on c8. So black can take the pawn on c3, but this endgame it's still quite sharp. Black is a pawn up, but white is very active with moves like knight d6. You can anchor the knight there with the support of the pawn. Things are far from simple, and objectively I think black will not be able to convert the extra pawn. But b4 was played, knight e7, And now the knight on c5 is in trouble. You cannot take because the rook on c3 is hanging. So the big question is what should be played now? Ding played very fast here to move rook g3, setting up a counterattack against the pawn on g7. But that is not that dangerous. The king is happy to come to the center anyway. In hindsight, maybe king d2 would have been a better defensive idea. Giving up the pawn on c5 and try to defend this slightly inferior endgame, which is not a nice thing to do, but okay, there are possibilities if you hang on to the pawn on b5. a7 is also a liability. Rook to g3, doubling on the g file, and now g6 would have been a very simple reaction, but Nepo wanted to simplify. Took on c5, b takes, rook takes g7, king f8. King is absolutely safe here, and it's not clear what the rooks are going to do on the g file. Bishop d3 to cover the entry square for the rook on the second rank, and you're happy to come over with your king to e2. And now, well, black could have taken the pawn, but after bishop takes b5, rook takes, rook g8, king e7, white wins the rook, but not for long. It's rook b1, king e2, rook takes g1, and we have an endgame. We will get to see something very similar in the game. After rook c7, though, you can win the pawn on a7. Black is going to win the pawn on the fourth rank. He goes rook g4, f3, protecting, and this endgame we have seen before in the match. A lot of these endgames, they are pretty drawish anyway, when everything is liquidated just to one wing. Rook d8 instead. It's a more ambitious move, and now big moment, because what to do with the bishop? Well, in the game there followed king e2, which is not the most precise move. King d2 was apparently better, but it feels very unnatural to place your king in the pin. But the main advantage of king d2 is that it does cover this c3 square, because after king e2, black played the move rook to c3. Just one final line after king d2. If you go bishop takes b5, it's rook g8, king e7, rook takes d8, king takes. Now you can swap the bishops, and well, you get this endgame in which white is still a pawn down, but has very good drawing chances. But there followed king e2. Nepo blitzed out the move rook c3, questioning the bishop. Rook g8 check, king e7. Now very important, you cannot protect the bishop on d3 with rook a to g3, because of rook takes d3, rook takes, bishop takes b5, everything gets traded, and black will have a winning king and pawn endgame thanks to the outside past the a pawn. So the other rook went to g3, and this is very important, because if you do take now on d3 with the same idea, in case of rook takes d3, it's bishop takes b5, it's game over. But here white would still have the move rook takes e8, intermediate check, and now we get this endgame with equal number of pawns. That's going to be a draw. Nepo just had a quick walk, came back to the board, and almost blitzed out his move e5, which is positionally speaking a very nice move, fixing the pawn on light squares, making the bishop on d3 look worse. But instead, he could have gone here for the move rook to b3, which is a fantastic idea. The main point is that if white would go rook h8, there's not much else you can do. There could follow rook to d4. And white's idea to double on the back rank can just be met by bishop to d7. And look at this bishop on d3. It almost doesn't have any squares. Everything is hanging. If the bishop goes away, you take on b5 with check. And look at black's pieces. They are wonderfully working together, setting up an attack against the white king. This could have won the game for black. Instead, there followed e5. But now rook h8, excellent defense by Ding. So that if you would play something like rook b3 now, it's rook g to g8, doubling on the back rank, which was overlooked by Nepo. Whenever you take the bishop, you can take on e8, and we get an equal endgame. Instead, there followed rook d6, protecting the pawn on h6, and in case of something like rook g8, there's bishop d7 again. So now rook g8 is not a big problem. You got to keep the bishop defended. But what is white gonna do? Well, Ding spent here a couple of minutes. He had like 9 minutes left. burned like 6 of these 9 minutes and found this move b6. What an incredible idea. There are so many tactics with bishops being pinned. Before we had this rook on d8 being pinned. Now there is this rooks on the third rank which are opposing each other. But what is the idea of this move b6? Well, if you do take the pawn, which is what happened, there's rook takes e8, king takes e8, bishop to b5 with a discover check. You're regaining the material, but this endgame, you're still a pawn down. And the engines are saying that it's dead equal. Engines are saying it, but this is a very, very difficult endgame from a human perspective. You still got to deal with this outside passed a pawn. And how should white defend it? Well, first step is trying to get the rook behind the passed pawn. That's the main idea. Black's going to play king d7, preventing the rook from getting behind immediately. But now we have rook f3, attacking the pawn on f7. King e7, rook c3. So of course white would be relieved to make a repetition here, but black goes a5, rook c7 check, king f6, keeping the pawn on f7 defended, rook c6, king g7, black has to defend the pawn on h6 as well, and now the rook gets behind. So that's the ideal place for the rook. And now black is going to improve its own rook. Goes rook b2, king f3, rook a2. So the next plan is trying to bring up the pawn and activate the king again. But whether this is going to be enough to win, we will see. White goes king g3. The rook has to stay behind and white is going to make a number of waiting moves. Black goes h5, rook a8, waiting moves with the rook along the a file is absolutely fine. Rook a1, king g2, a4, rook a5. Attacking the pawn, black goes f6. So now it's very important to realize that if you just are giving careless checks with say rook a7, black is very happy to bring its king over to the other side of the board. Even if he would have to give up that pawn on f6, he simply doesn't care. There is rook e1, so that you're about to take on e4, and the rook is doing an excellent job along the fourth rank, so that it protects the pawn on a4, covers the pawn on h4 as well, and you're planning to bring up the king, push the pawn, and the rook can eventually interfere against any checks or get behind on the a file. This would be technically winning. So instead, it's much more clever trying to keep an eye on the black king so that it cannot come over that easily. King f3, a3 played, rook a6, excellent move. So now whenever black would go a7, well, it's, if you go a2, then the king is absolutely fine on f3. And even if the king would come over to b3, it's not gonna lead anywhere, because you are going to give checks from behind. Once the king is on b3, the checks, they are good enough, and there's no longer any place to hide for the king in front of the pawn. So for that reason, the pawn stays on a3 for the moment. King f7 and king e3. There are other moves as well. And well, there are also possibilities for black to give up the pawn on a3 for the h-pawn. But these 3 versus 2, they are generally considered to be a draw. King e8. Don't take the pawn on f6. This is a little trick, because there is the move a2. And now there's no chance to get back in time because of the move rook e1, check, and the a-pawn queens. So this time with the king on e3, you cannot take the pawn. King e2 was played, and now king e7. King f3, rook a2. Apparently it's very difficult to make any progress, because the pawn on f6 could be taken any time. Let's say if you go back 1 or 2 moves instead of king e7, if you go king d7, now it's time to take on f6, because if you play a2, there is rook a6, and look at the difference with the king on e2, there's no rook e1 check. So that's why king e7, king f3, rook a2, king e3, rook a1, king e2, king f7, king f3, rook a2, king e3. So players go back and forth. And, well, king f3 is once again a very good move. Black is unable to make any progress and decides to go for king d7 anyway. But there is rook takes f6. Rook b2. And now rook a6. The rook gets behind the pawn. If you go a2, white has a very simple plan of going king g3 followed by f4. And there is enough counterplay, because we are creating a passed pawn ourselves. Instead, Nepo goes for rook b3, which is very interesting. After king g2, king to c7. Now, if you would go for rook a5, trying to collect the pawn on e5, the a pawn is simply too strong. So still, the rook got to stay behind the passed pawn to retain control over the queening square. White plays f4, fantastic resource, with the idea that after e takes f4, there is e5, and the e pawn is creating a lot of counterplay, forcing the king to stay within the square to cover that pawn. King b7, rook a4, king c6. And now, of course, white should stay away from the pawn, because there is king d5, and on the next move you're going to win this pawn, and then there's no longer any counterplay. White really needs to keep that e pawn on the board, and therefore plays here the move rook a6. Excellent idea. So that after king d5 you have e6, and the king has been cut off. White is threatening to push the pawn, trade off the e pawn versus the a pawn with a relatively an easy draw. So instead black goes king b5, attacks the rook. Rook a7, interesting move. Rook king b6 played, and now rook a8. So trying to force the king to go a little bit further away from its own a pawn. But king c5 played. Now rook a6. So once again, if you go king d5, we have the move e6 with an easy draw. King to b5, rook a7. We have seen this before. Rook a8, king c6, rook a6, and well, there's no way to make progress. Black decided to come back with the king to d7, king f2, and now we have the ideal setup. The rook prevents the king from getting in touch with the e pawn, and it also stays behind the a pawn. So the only thing white has to do is making king moves, and if given the chance, it will of course try to collect the pawn on f4. King e7, king g2, rook e3, king f2. If you do take, there's rook takes a3, and very soon the king will come up to eliminate the other pawn. Rook g3 played, king f1. Black is not going to do anything, just making waiting moves. That's good enough. King d7, king f2, king c7, e6. So still, the king is not able to get in touch with the e pawn. If king b7, we just go rook a4, and we are ready to push the pawn next. Instead, king d8 played, but now rook a7 is a very simple move, cutting off the king along the 7th rank this time. After king e8, it's king g2, and, well, once again, I said it already, there's no way to make any progress. Black decided to take on e6, rook takes a3, rook g6, it's the last trap of the game. King f3 runs into rook g3 and pick up the rook, but that's not something you're going to see in the last round of the World Championship match. King f2 played, rook g4, black is going to win a second pawn, but these pawns are really weak, and well, white is just going to collect them. King e6, rook takes f4, rook takes, king takes, and the h pawn is not dangerous at all. It's a draw. Game 14 of the match ended in a draw. What an amazing game. They played for over 6.5 hours, 91 moves, longest game of the match, where a lot of people expected it would have been a very solid, boring, quick draw, whatever. They absolutely created a masterpiece. So the big winners of this round are the spectators. Tomorrow we will get to see a big winner when the tiebreak is going to be played. It's going to be 4 rapid games of playing time control of 25 minutes plus 10 seconds of increment. And of course, if it could also be decided in 3 games if it's 2.5 for instance. But anyway, for now, the players are exhausted after this marathon game. They're going to have a rest. It's going to be a short night as they have to prepare as well. But then tomorrow we know who is going to be the new world champion, dethroning Magnus Carlsen. Looking forward to see you then. Bye bye.